We've been getting a lot of rear end action lately, and whilst that's been fun, I think this time we'll start at the front. So in my spare time I've been doing a fair bit of work on the front suspension. I've moved the damper and spring mounting from its original location on the top A-arm pivot bolt up to its own mounting point up the top here. That gives a little bit more possible suspension travel, but its main advantage is that it gives the spring and damper a much better motion ratio. I've upgraded a few of the ends of the suspension arms, sort of made them a little bit larger. I've increased the diameter of this suspension arm and cleared a little bit more room in the chassis because the original arm had a big bend in it where it had collided with the chassis rail down there. I've managed to graft the hub from the Alpha with the 108 PCD onto the Fiat stub axle and upright, and just upgraded the original ball joint to this nice shiny M14 rod end. Also made a mount for the caliper that we're going to be using. So the front end's nearly finished. The last thing we need to look at is an anti-roll bar. This chassis never had any mounts for an anti-roll bar, and I think we're going to need one. So it's all getting fairly tight in this area, but I think what we'll do is run the anti-roll bar through here where this aluminium rod is. Clearly we won't be using an aluminium rod for the anti-roll bar. That would be a terrible material choice. But we'll be running it along there somewhere with a little bend coming back to a drop link down to the back of the bottom arm. And looking at a few photos, that's a pretty common way of doing it on these chassis. So I think we've got a pretty good location and the general dimensions of the ARB. Next thing we need to work out is the diameter. So anti-roll bars, where do we start? Well, as you can imagine, we can't just look at the anti-roll bars independently. We need to look at the overall spring rate of the vehicle as well, because both the springs and the anti-roll bars provide the roll resistance of the vehicle. I've got this little program here called SusProg 3D. It's an Australian program for suspension geometry and design. And as you know, I've put I've built a CAD model of nearly the entire car now. So it was a fairly easy operation to get every suspension point in the 3D coordinates that this program requires to do its thing. So first thing we need to look at is spring rates. We've also got some masses of the vehicle in the program. If we go to this tab, you can see we can put in a suspension frequency that we desire. I've chosen 2 Hertz. That's a pretty sort of standard starting point for suspension frequency for a sort of high performance road car / race car. And you can see with a suspension frequency of 2 Hertz, we require a spring rate on the front of 56 newtons per millimetre or 330 pounds per inch. We can do the same for the rear of the car. And for the same suspension frequency, and it's another general rule to try and keep the frequency of the front and rear suspensions the same so that the car doesn't behave unpredictably when it hits a disturbance. And for that same suspension frequency of 2 Hertz, we get a spring rate of 46 newtons per millimetre and 266 pounds per inch. Seems a little bit counterintuitive that the rear spring rate is lower than the front, but you've got to take into account the motion ratio. Because it's a McPherson strut, the motion ratio on the rear is nearly 1:1, and it's a lot less than that on the front. So now that we've got an idea of spring rates, we can start having a look at the anti-roll bars. Like I said, I've worked out the packaging of the anti-roll bars front and rear. So that gives us the basic lengths and the moment arms that the ARBs will be working through. I've added that information to SUSProg. And if we click on the dynamic tab and go to results, we get this lovely page of text, which gives us a lot of useful information. We get the anti-roll stiffness front and rear, and this bottom line here is the resultant values of the vehicle at a 1G corner. So over here we've got the resultant corner weights at 1G due to the weight transfer, and the roll angle of the vehicle at 1G. So using a couple of rules of thumb of having a roll angle at 1G of around 1.5, 1 to 1.5, which we've sort of got, and a corner weight increase of 5% on the front from static, which we've sort of got here, I've come up with running a 16mm front anti-roll bar and a 25mm rear. So as good as SUSProg is, those values are really just a starting point, and there is a very high likelihood of having to change those bar diameters once we actually start driving the car. So we need to make sure that the chassis mounts can accommodate different anti-roll bar diameters. I've got these bushes from Super Pro. They're a generic anti-roll bar bush, and they're available with a hole size from 12mm all the way up to 30mm. So that should cover us for both the front and the rear of the car. So now we just need to make up some brackets. I've got a round bit, I've got a rectangle bit, I've got some nuts. I think that's everything. Let's make a bracket. So, I think they'll work. Only two more things to do. One, and fit them to the car. Did I say two more things? I meant three. The third being fit the brackets to the car, weld in some captive nuts into the chassis, and then decide that you want the brackets 15mm lower than they were. So now you can see why I wanted to drop that mount down by 15mm, just to get a little bit more clearance to that top arm. The suspension is at full droop at the moment, limited by this rod end. We'll set the droop limiter so that we never get to that point, because we don't want to damage the rod end, so it's more likely to be somewhere like there, which I think is a good amount of clearance. It's not all great news though. Bit hard to get a good camera angle, but the limiting factor to how low I could drop the bar was really the universal joint on the pinion of the rack. It's quite close there, so it was a bit of a trade-off to not hitting the pinion or the uni joint and not hitting the top arm. But I think I've got a good compromise now. So on to the back. This was going to be a simple job of just mounting a couple of little saddle brackets onto the back chassis rail like that, which would have been super easy. But due to the fact that I have filled the back of the car with an exhaust system, that's not an option anymore. It's also getting very close to the alternator that doesn't fit anyway. So with that option not being an option, we're left to fitting it on the outside of the chassis rail. It can't go above these standoffs because that's where the bodywork comes down to, and it can't really go underneath the standoffs because there's not really enough room between the standoff and the muffler. Can't go above it, can't go below it. Guess we're going to have to go through it. Plenty of clearance to the muffler and plenty of clearance to the two little mufflers. With the ARB mounts fitted to the car, I've finally found some wheel studs to suit the 13mm holes that were in the Alpha wheel hub. The front end's nearly finished now, and I think we can actually bolt the wheel on for the first time. So that's pretty exciting and a good place to finish this episode at. I think next time we'll look at mounting an oil cooler. Should be pretty simple. Thanks for watching.